What's up Sega fans, it's Dan the Mega Driver here of the SEGAGuys, and I've just come back from a vacation in Japan. It was a trip for family reasons more than anything else, but it gave me the opportunity to take in the sights and the sounds of the land of the rising sun, especially with the sakura in full bloom in this beautiful country while we were lucky enough to be there. It's a wonderful place where you can really drink your fill of the rich culture and history with so many amazing things to explore. But look, this is the SEGAGuys, right? So while I'm sure a lot of you will appreciate the culture, most of you are going to be interested in the games. So of course, while I was in Japan, I did have to explore the retro gaming scene out there, or at least as much as I could. And I think it's best that I break it down into 3 sections and we'll cover the stores first. While I was in Japan, I visited Himeji, Osaka, Kyoto and Tokyo. But rather than talk about the shops regionally, I'm going to go store by store. Most of my game hunting was done in Osaka and Tokyo. The question I'm sure you're all asking right now is whether if Japan really is this nirvana of cheap games. And the answer is extremely nuanced. You've probably heard of stores like Super Potato, which has branches in Tokyo and Osaka, and if so, you might have heard that it's slightly overpriced. In all honesty, at worst, Super Potato is kind of in line with Western prices, but there are deals to be had. Generally, it's the pricier of all the stores that I visited, but that's not always the case. In fact, I probably bought more games from those branches than anywhere else. It has, hands down, the biggest selection of Sega games in both cities. You're more likely to find a copy of Secondhand Rentai here than anywhere else, but you also need to cough up some pretty big bucks in order to get the premium games. Still, in Osaka, I managed to pick up Gero Mark of the Wolves, Virtuon Otario Tangram, NFL 2K, and 2Com Resident 4 for the Dreamcast for decent prices, while I also got Grand Chaser for the Sega Saturn at less than £1 in Tokyo. In Osaka, Retro TV Game Revival was cheaper, but not by an enormous amount, and it had a much smaller selection. Still, it's definitely worth checking out if you're over there, since I got a cheap Zap snowboarding tricks for the Sega Saturn and this brilliant Japanese Mega Drive for pretty cheap. In Akihabara in Tokyo, however, there's an abundance of stores. Retro Game Camp takes pride in refreshing their stock and changing batteries for very reasonable prices, though the only thing that I got from there was a PSP battery. Beep is a basement level store that I thought was quite hard to find, but once you're inside there's all sorts of magnificent retro goods, not just games but guides, soundtracks and clothes as well. It's here that I got a copy of Starblade for the Mega CD for a very cheap price. Next to Beep is a branch of SEGAGuys Specialty Store, a retro gaming focused branch of the Secondhand hobby change with a great selection and great prices, and it's here that I got my hands on King of Fighters 2001 for the Sega Dreamcast. Last but certainly not least is my favourite shop in Akihabara, Traders. It has a selection that rivals Super Potato with prices that give it an absolute kicking. It's here that I got King of Fighters 2002 for the Dreamcast. I also got this absolutely stunning Lethal Enforcers 2 Mega CD bundle and landed a game I never thought I'd see in the wild, the Saturn port of Metal Slug. Now those are the main stores and worth checking out if you're in Japan, however they're not the be all and end all. Secondhand stores can be a veritable goldmine. Chains like Book Off and Off House can be found all over and sell secondhand books, manga, DVD and video games. Of course, their selection doesn't come close to the specialty stores, but they're so much cheaper. I ended up with a few things as cheap as a few £100, like a Dragon Kenzan, 2 Project Diva games, as well as a fully boxed Donkey Kong Country 2 and this Famiclone console. But occasionally you'll find an absolute diamond. I was touring around Kyoto when I stumbled across a Book Off, and when I peeked inside I found this astonishing Nights into Dreams bundle for the equivalent of about £20. And following a tip from Twitter friend Richard Dotor, I visited the Shinjuku Book Off and found Nanatsu Kaze Noshima Monogatari for a fraction of its online cost. So yes, those secondhand stores, they can hide some absolute treasures. But that being said, Sega stock is extremely low in most stores. Let's move on to arcades. Now in the modern day, Sega is an absolute titan in Japan. Again, you'll see their huge displays in electronic stores way before you see anything Xbox related. Nowhere is this stature more apparent than in arcades. Despite selling their arcade buildings, most arcade machines have the Sega name. Now for the most part, these aren't the Sega games as you know them. You'll mostly see lines and lines of My cabinets, Wonderful Wars machines, and many other card and rhythm based titles. But as you reach the zenith of the bigger multi-level arcades, where sadly most of the 2 or 3 floors below are claw machines, you'll find more traditional arcades. Virtua Fighter in both 3TB Online and 5 Ultimate Showdown esports flavours can be played and are promoted very heavily. I managed to win 2 out of 4 matches on 3TB, but got absolutely annihilated on esports. In some arcades such as Kasuga Garakujo or Taito Game Center in Shinjuku or Akihabara, you'll find an absolute ton of retro arcade games. Highlights for me were a complete bank of 4 Spike Up cabs, Daytona 2 and Scud Race machines, Virtua Racing, Crazy Taxi, Virtual-On Versus cabinets, and seeing both Jurassic Park and Lucky and Wild in person, which was absolutely insane. Granted, I know Lucky and Wild isn't a Sega game, but still. Even the incredible arcade club in Bury was missing a few of these classics. To top it off, there was no shortage of other classics from all over, from Donkey Kong to King of Fighters, Manx TT to Street Fighter 3, Emergency Call Ambulance to Galaga. There were arcade games galore. At 100 yen a go, credits were cheap too, though I found myself quickly depleting my pockets full of change. House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn did demand 200 yen up front though, but in return it provided me with a good 10 minutes of playtime. Sadly, these arcades aren't as prominent as they once were, and the recent news of thousands closing down is actually heartbreaking. But having the ability to experience them in these main cities is absolutely beautiful. It's also great to see a few fighting games take centre stage on these floors as well. Tekken 7 cabinets were extremely busy, the aforementioned Virtua Fighter games were prominent, and the new Street Fighter 6 type arcade machines brought back the competitive edge to the scene. Arcades certainly aren't what they once were, but the scene is still busy where I visited in Japan, and even if the youths are flocking to these Sega and Namco card and music machines, it's still good to see that the arcade hasn't completely given way as it has in the West. My favourite arcade was Gigo in Akihabara, because as you can see from this footage, it was an absolute Sega nirvana, unlike anything else since Sega World. Now the last thing I wanted to touch on was my visits to Dotonbori and Kabukicho, the real life areas where Sotenbori and Kamurocho from the Yakuza games are based. I went to Kabukicho during the day and well, it's pretty unseemly in some places, much more than anywhere else where I went in Japan. The famous main strip is there, complete with the gate, and so many other landmarks are there, just like the Gigo Arcade, Don Quixote, and while the hotel isn't quite as big as Millennium Tower, it has Godzilla, so it evens out. I could even find landmarks like the other gates, some batting cages, and even the car park which is near the Millennium Tower in the games. But to me that underlined that the layout of Kabukicho is quite different from Kamurocho though. Perhaps this is to be expected, but the problem for me is that I actually went to Dotonbori first. Maybe it's a simpler layout, or maybe it's because I went at night, but Dotonbori is almost exactly replicated in the Like a Dragon games, from the restaurants to the river, the bridges, the neon signs, the markets, the back streets, everything. It's an enormously busy and bustling area, and honestly I could not stop smiling all the way around. As a fan of the Yakuza games and series, visiting both places was extremely special. Like real life living theme parks, and I'd encourage any fans of the series to make that pilgrimage if you ever make it to Japan. So that's that on the gaming side of my visit to Japan. It was an absolutely sensational trip that surpassed my expectations. It wasn't just the gaming, but the sights, the sounds and the people, especially our friends and hosts, and a huge thank you to them, and big shout out to my friend Yosuke who beat the absolute brakes off me in Tekken 5. Thank you dear viewers for making it to the end of the video. We do hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the Sega side.